It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Gavin Hall laughed as he tossed Valerie Marie Hall's original project renderings into the gray slush of the curb outside the Metropolitan Gala. The expensive vellum paper, months of her sweat and late-night calculations, soaked up the oily street water instantly. A dozen members of the city's elite stood under the gold-leafed awning, their breath hitching in the freezing air, but no one moved to help. "Architecture is for people with vision, Valerie," he said, his voice carrying over the idling engines of a line of black town cars. "Not for glorified secretaries who think a marriage certificate is a shortcut to the C-suite. You're a liability to G-Build's brand, always have been." He clicked his designer lighter, the sharp metallic asterisk snick asterisk echoing against the marble pillars of the hotel. The scent of expensive cedarwood and imported tobacco drifted toward her, a smell she had once associated with success, but now only recognized as the stench of his arrogance. He didn't even look at her as he lit a cigar, his eyes fixed on the admiring glances of the board members behind him. Valerie stood her ground, though the winter wind bit through her modest wool coat. She didn't scramble for the ruined papers. She didn't cry. She simply watched the ink of her designs bleed into the mud. "Those designs won us the Northside contract, Gavin," she said, her voice steady and low. He snorted, a plume of smoke escaping his nostrils. "Correction. My name on the letterhead won the contract. Your sketches were just the coloring book I used to entertain the clients." Beside him, Justin stepped forward. Her ex-husband didn't meet her eyes at first. He was too busy adjusting the lapels of a tuxedo that Valerie had paid for 3 years ago, back when she still believed his promises of a partnership. Now he was Gavin's shadow, a man who had traded his integrity for a seat at a table he hadn't built. "Give it a rest, Val," Justin said, finally looking up with a patronizing smirk. "You should be thanking Gavin. He's giving you a clean break. Take your settlement and go buy some better shoes. You look like a beggar standing next to these people." He reached out and flicked a stray piece of lint off Gavin's shoulder, a gesture so subservient it made Valerie's skin crawl. The witnesses, men and women she had hosted at her own dinner table, shared a collective, stifled chuckle. The humiliation was the point. Gavin wanted her small, broken, and erased before the night's festivities even began. Valerie felt a familiar weight in her pocket, the small, cold rectangle of her burner phone. She thought of Lily, tucked into bed at home, dreaming of a mother who was a builder, not a victim. She thought of the 5 years she had spent working in the shadows, funneling her genius into a man who couldn't even calculate a load-bearing wall without her help. "I see," Valerie said. She took a single step closer, moving into the circle of light under the awning. The movement was so deliberate that the laughter died down. "You're firing me, in front of the entire board, on the night of the merger announcement." Gavin leaned in, his face reddening from the bourbon he'd been nursing since 4 o'clock. "I'm purging the dead weight. You're not just fired, Valerie, you're banned. If I see your face inside this gala, or any G-Build property, I'll have security treat you like the trespasser you are." He turned his back on her, a dismissal so complete it should have been crushing. He gestured for the group to follow him toward the heavy oak doors of the ballroom. "Wait," Valerie said. Gavin stopped, his hand on the brass handle. He looked back over his shoulder, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "What, going to beg? Justin, does she have a please in her?" Justin laughed, the sound hollow and sharp. "She's persistent, I'll give her that, but persistence doesn't pay the bills, does it?" Valerie didn't look at Justin. He was a ghost to her now. She kept her eyes locked on the back of Gavin's head. "I just wanted to make sure I heard you correctly. You're claiming full ownership of the Northside assets, and you're officially severing my access to the G-Build accounts as of this moment." "Every cent," Gavin barked. "Now get off my sidewalk before I have the valet call the police." He disappeared inside, the board members filing in after him like a trail of expensive silk and perfume. Justin was the last to enter, giving her one final, dismissive glance before the heavy doors swung shut, cutting off the warmth and the light of the lobby. Valerie was left alone in the dark, the snow beginning to fall in thick, heavy flakes that covered her ruined drawings. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the phone. She didn't call a taxi. She didn't call a friend. She dialed a number she had memorized months ago. "Marcus," she said when the line picked up on the first ring. Her voice was no longer the voice of a discarded wife or an overlooked architect. It was the cold, sharp tone of a woman who had been counting the days until this exact moment. "I'm here, Valerie," Marcus replied. The sound of rustling papers came through the line legal documents, the kind that didn't bleed in the rain. "I saw the live stream of the arrivals. He did it, didn't he? Publicly, in front of the entire executive committee and the primary investors," she said, watching her breath mist in the air. "He claimed the Northside assets as his personal intellectual property and terminated my standing. He even used the word trespasser." "Then he just signed his own death warrant," Marcus said, and she could hear the grim satisfaction in his voice. "The sleeping lion clause is now active. Since he's officially severed your ties to G-Build, he no longer has the liability shield provided by your marriage or your employment contract." Valerie looked down at the slush. She saw a corner of a blueprint, the foundation of a skyscraper that would now never be built under the name Hall. "He thinks he just threw away a liability," Valerie whispered, a small, dangerous smile touching her lips. "He has no idea he just threw away the only person who was holding the ceiling up." "What's the first move?" Marcus asked. Valerie watched as a group of late-arriving investors stepped out of a limousine, their eyes raking over her plain coat with disdain as they hurried toward the warmth Gavin had promised them. "The Northside land isn't owned by G-Build," Valerie said, her voice like cracking ice. "It's owned by VM Holdings, and I am VM Holdings. Call the leasing agent. Tell them we're exercising the immediate vacancy clause for the gala venue. I want the lights out and the doors locked before Gavin finishes his first toast." She hung up and tucked the phone away. She didn't need the blueprints in the gutter. She had the master plan in her head, and for the first time in 7 years, the house of cards Gavin Hall called an empire was starting to shake. She turned away from the gold-leafed awning and walked into the storm, leaving the ruined paper to rot in the cold. The countdown had begun. 10 minutes until the lights went out. 2 days until Gavin realized he didn't even own the chair he was sitting in. And 1 week until Valerie Marie Hall took it all back. Gavin Hall paced the length of his mahogany-paneled office, the scent of expensive Cuban tobacco and bitter stress sweat thick in the air. He slammed a heavy fist onto the glass desk, rattling a gold-plated pen set that cost more than most people's cars. "A fuse! You're telling me the most important launch in G-Build history was ruined by a faulty fuse?" Gavin's voice was a jagged blade, cutting through the quiet of the executive suite. Justin stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his reflection ghostly against the backdrop of the city skyline. He shifted his weight, refusing to meet his boss's eyes. "The leasing agent didn't mention a fuse, Gavin. He mentioned a contract violation. Something about an immediate vacancy clause triggered by the parent holding company." "Nonsense," Gavin snapped, waving a hand dismissively. He turned his vitriol toward the door as Valerie walked in. She carried a stack of manila folders, her expression carefully neutral, though her heart hammered a steady rhythm of anticipation against her ribs. Gavin didn't see the woman who had co-founded the original firm with him. He didn't see the mother of the child Justin had abandoned for a paycheck. He saw a servant. "You!" Gavin sneered, pointing a trembling finger at her. "Where is my coffee? And why is your daughter's school calling the front desk again? Tell that brat to stop bothering my receptionists with her emergencies. I don't pay you to be a mother on company time." Valerie gripped the folders tighter, her knuckles turning white. The insult to Lily was a fresh spark in a furnace of old resentment. "Lily had a high fever, Gavin. The school couldn't reach me because you had me in the basement archives all night cross-referencing the G-Build audits." Gavin stepped into her personal space, the smell of his entitlement stifling. He reached out and flicked the lapel of her modest wool coat with a look of pure disgust. "Look at you. You look like you shop at a thrift store for the blind. It's embarrassing to have you on the payroll, let alone in my sight. If you weren't so loyal, and by that, I mean cheap, I'd have replaced you years ago with someone who actually fits the G-build aesthetic." Justin let out a sharp, sycophantic chuckle from the corner. "He's right, Val. You're bringing down the property value of the office just by standing there. Maybe take the school's call in the break room next time. Or better yet, the parking lot." Valerie didn't flinch. She simply placed the files on the desk. Gavin thought these were routine internal audits, the boring paperwork he was too important to read. He had no idea they were the final nails in his professional coffin. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, her voice like a calm sea before a hurricane. "I've finished the reconciliation for the stadium project. Everything is ready for the groundbreaking ceremony." Gavin's mood shifted instantly, his ego inflating as he straightened his silk tie. "Finally, the governor will be there in 3 days. Every major developer in the state is coming to watch me turn that first shovel of dirt. It's the biggest land lease in the history of this county." "It certainly is," Valerie murmured. An hour later, she sat in the back of a nondescript sedan parked 3 blocks away. Marcus sat in the driver's seat, tapping a rhythmic beat on the steering wheel. He handed her a sleek digital tablet. "The signatures are exactly where we thought they'd be," Marcus said, his voice low and professional. "Gavin didn't just sideline you 7 years ago. He systematically forged your resignation from the venture capital board. But he made a fatal error in his arrogance. He never checked the inheritance structure of VM Holdings when the original trust matured last month." Valerie scrolled through the documents. There it was, in black and white. Valerie Marie Hall was listed as the sole owner of the land G-Build was currently trespassing on. Gavin had spent $40 million of investor money building a stadium on dirt he didn't own. "He thinks he's standing on a mountain," Valerie said, watching a raindrop trail down the window. "He doesn't realize it's a trapdoor." "We can file the injunction now," Marcus suggested. "Stop the ceremony before it starts." Valerie looked at the gold-leafed invitation to the groundbreaking ceremony tucked into her purse. She thought of Gavin's sneer and Justin's betrayal. She thought of Lily's fever and the years of being treated like a ghost in her own kingdom. "No," she said, a cold smile finally touching her lips. "I want him to have his stage. I want him to invite the world to watch his greatest triumph. Because in 72 hours, I'm going to show everyone that Gavin Hall doesn't even own the dirt under his fingernails." She tucked the tablet away, the countdown echoing in her mind. 3 days. 3 days until the ground broke and Gavin Hall finally fell through. The heavy steel door of the private vault groaned as Marcus pulled it open, the sound echoing through the sterile, climate-controlled basement of the Zurich-managed facility. The air here didn't smell like the city's exhaust or the cheap, floral perfume Gavin favored for his receptionists. It smelled of aged cedar, cold brass, and the dry, metallic scent of absolute security. Valerie Marie Hall stepped into the small, brightly lit room. She didn't look like the woman who had spent the last week scrubbing floorboards or counting pennies for Lily's medicine. Her spine was a rod of tempered steel, her eyes reflecting the clinical glow of the overhead lights. Marcus reached into the safety deposit box and pulled out a leather-bound folio embossed with a gold crest. He laid it on the velvet-lined table with the reverence of a priest handling a relic. "The Zurich Protocol, Valerie. It's been sitting here for 15 years, just as your father intended. He knew Gavin Hall would eventually try to burn the kingdom down to feel the warmth of the fire." She ran her fingers over the cool leather. Inside these pages lay the original land grants, the irrevocable trusts, and the specific clause that Gavin had spent a decade trying to bury. He thought he had inherited the earth. He didn't realize he was merely a tenant on a lease that was about to expire. "He's already moving the heavy machinery onto the site," Marcus whispered, his voice tight with anticipation. "The investors are pouring in the final $40 million today. If we reveal this now, we stop the bleeding." "No," Valerie said, her voice a low, melodic hum that carried the weight of a death sentence. "If we stop him now, he's just a failed businessman. I want him to be a monument to his own greed. I want him to stand on that stage in 48 hours and tell the world he's a king. Only then will I remind him that he's a squatter." She tucked the folio into a plain, nondescript messenger bag. To anyone on the street, she was just another mother heading to a bus stop. To the man sitting in the penthouse 3 blocks away, she was a ghost he thought he'd successfully exorcised. The transition to Gavin's office was like stepping from a sanctuary into a circus. The air was thick with the scent of $400 an ounce scotch and the frantic energy of assistants scurrying to meet impossible deadlines. Gavin Hall sat behind a desk carved from a single piece of obsidian, his feet propped up as he laughed into a gold-plated smartphone. Justin stood by the window, looking uncomfortable in a suit that clearly cost more than his integrity. He looked up as Valerie entered, his expression flickering with a mixture of guilt and annoyance. "Valerie, what the hell are you doing here?" Justin snapped, stepping forward to intercept her. "I told you the child support adjustment is being handled by the lawyers. You can't just keep showing up at the office looking like this." He gestured vaguely at her simple denim jacket and worn boots. Gavin didn't even look up at first. He finished his conversation, tossed the phone onto the desk, and finally fixed her with a look of bored contempt. "Let me guess. Lily needs another specialist? Or did the radiator in that hovel you call an apartment finally give out?" He stood, smoothing the front of his bespoke Italian blazer. He walked around the desk, the ice in his Scotch glass clinking with a rhythmic, mocking sound. He stopped inches from her, radiating the heat of unearned confidence. "You're a persistent little thing, aren't you?" Gavin sneered, his voice loud enough to make the 2 assistants at the door pause and watch. "I gave you a name, I gave you a life, and when you weren't enough to keep me interested, I gave you a graceful exit. Most women would be grateful, but you just keep lingering like a bad smell." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a clip of $100 bills and peeled off 5. He let them flutter onto the floor at her feet. "Buy yourself a dress that doesn't scream charity case, and buy the kids something that isn't from a thrift store. Just stay away from the ceremony on Thursday. You're bad for the brand, Valerie. You look like failure, and I'm about to become the face of the city." Justin stepped in, his voice hushed but sharp. "Val, just take the money and go." "You're embarrassing yourself. Gavin is about to break ground on the biggest project in the state. Don't make me call security." Valerie didn't look at the money on the floor. She didn't look at Justin, the man who had traded his daughter's future for a title at a failing company. She looked directly into Gavin's eyes. She saw the fear he hid behind the bravado, the hollow core of a man who built his life on sand. "You're right, Gavin," she said, her voice calm, almost conversational. "Appearances are everything. You've spent $40 million making sure everyone sees what you want them to see. The lights, the steel, the stadium." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. "But you forgot to check the foundation. You're so busy looking at the sky that you've forgotten who owns the dirt you're standing on." Gavin's smirk didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed. "I own everything I touch, Valerie. That's the difference between us. I take what I want, you just wait for permission." "Enjoy the scotch, Gavin," she said, turning toward the door. "And make sure you wear your best suit on Thursday. It's going to be a very long day." As she walked out, she could hear Gavin's forced, booming laughter behind her, followed by Justin's sycophantic chuckle. They thought they had won another round against a woman who had nothing left to lose. Outside, the humidity of the afternoon pressed against her, but Valerie felt a cold, refreshing clarity. She reached into her bag and touched the corner of the Zurich folio. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from Marcus. "The injunction is drafted. The media list is confirmed. We are at T-minus 48 hours. Valerie looked up at the massive G-Build logo glowing atop the skyscraper. It looked so permanent, so solid. She thought of Lily, currently resting at Marcus's house under the care of a private nurse she could finally afford. She thought of the years of being told she was nothing. She didn't feel like nothing. She felt like a landslide. She pulled out her phone and typed a single reply to Marcus, "Wait for the first shovel to hit the ground." "I want the world to see his face when he realizes the earth won't hold him up anymore." She stepped onto the bus, the messenger bag heavy against her hip, a silent countdown ticking in the back of her mind. 2 days. In 2 days, the Hall empire wouldn't just crumble, it would be reclaimed. The scent of expensive cedarwood and aged scotch hung heavy in the executive lounge of G-Build. a sharp contrast to the sterile, metallic smell of the construction site below. Gavin Hall stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghosting over the twinkling lights of the city he believed he finally owned. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clinking with a rhythmic, self-assured sound. He didn't hear the door open, but he felt the shift in the room's energy, a cold draft that seemed to follow the woman who had once been his silent partner in everything but name. He turned, a smirk tugging at his lips as he saw her standing by the mahogany sideboard. She looked out of place in her sensible wool coat and scuffed boots, a stark shadow against the velvet furniture. Gavin took a slow, deliberate sip of his drink, his eyes raking over her with practiced disdain. To him, she was a ghost of a life he had successfully buried, a minor inconvenience that had lingered far too long. "You're early for the funeral, Valerie," he said, his voice smooth and dripping with a condescending warmth. "The groundbreaking isn't until tomorrow morning. I didn't think you'd want to be there to see the first shovel of dirt hit the grave of your father's legacy." Valerie Marie Hall didn't flinch. She reached out, her fingers grazing the cool, polished marble of the sideboard. She could feel the vibration of the building's massive HVAC system beneath her touch, a mechanical heartbeat that she knew was based on a lie. She looked at him, her expression so unreadably calm that the smirk on his face faltered for a fraction of a second. "I'm not here for the legacy, Gavin," she replied, her voice low and steady. "I'm here to offer you a piece of advice. You should really check the structural integrity of the sub-basement levels before you invite the press tomorrow. Sometimes, the things we think are buried deepest are the first ones to cause a collapse." He let out a sharp, barking laugh that echoed off the glass walls. He set his glass down on a side table with a definitive thud, stepping closer until he was deep inside her personal space. He smelled of tobacco and an arrogance so thick it was almost tactile. "Advice? From you?" He shook his head, leaning down so his face was inches from hers. "You've spent 7 years playing house and pretending you're a martyr. I've spent 7 years building an empire. You don't have the standing to tell me how to lay a single brick. Go back to your little apartment and your little life. Leave the real world to the men who actually know how to own it." In the corner of the room, Justin shifted uncomfortably. He had been Gavin's shadow for years, the man who handled the details that were too dirty for the CEO's hands. He had watched Valerie for a long time, and the look in her eyes tonight made his skin crawl. It wasn't the look of a woman who had lost. It was the look of a predator watching a trap spring shut. He opened his mouth to say something, perhaps a warning of his own, but Gavin waved him off without looking back. "She's just bitter, Justin," Gavin sneered, turning his back on her to return to the window. "It's the only emotion people like her have left when they realize they've been outplayed." Valerie adjusted the strap of her bag, the weight of the Zurich folio pressing against her hip like a loaded weapon. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply turned toward the door, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor, a sound that seemed to count down the seconds. "The earth has a funny way of reclaiming what was stolen," she said over her shoulder. "I'd make sure your insurance is up to date, Gavin Hall, not for the building, for yourself." She stepped out into the hallway before he could respond. The elevator ride down was silent, the digital floor numbers flickering in the dark. As she stepped out into the cool night air, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcus. "The forensic auditors have finished the cross-reference. The offshore accounts Gavin used for the G-Build siphoning are tied directly to the land grant you hold. He's not just building on your land, Valerie. He's using your stolen capital to fund the construction." She looked up at the penthouse, where the lights were still burning bright. Gavin was likely pouring another drink, toasting to a victory that was already turning to ash. She thought of Lily, sleeping soundly in a room that was finally safe, and the rage that had fueled her for years settled into a cold, hard diamond of resolve. "T-minus 24 hours, she whispered to the empty street. She didn't go home. She walked toward the construction site, watching the massive yellow excavators sitting like sleeping beasts in the shadows. Tomorrow, the world would watch Gavin Hall take his victory lap. And tomorrow, Valerie would be the one to pull the ground from beneath his feet. The countdown wasn't just in her head anymore. It was in the very air, vibrating with the promise of a justice that had been 7 years in the making. One more day, one more sunrise. Then the landslide would begin. The scent of expensive lilies and damp, freshly turned earth hung heavy over the velvetroped enclosure. It was a suffocating mix of funeral and celebration. Gavin Hall stood at the center of a swarm of photographers, his teeth flashing a blinding, practiced white under the strobe lights. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than the average worker's annual salary, leaning casually on a silver-plated shovel that had never seen a day of actual labor. This was the groundbreaking for the Hall Heights, the crown jewel of G-Build, and the air hummed with the high-frequency vibration of 100 conversations, all centered on one man's ego. Valerie Marie Hall stood at the very edge of the crowd, her presence as inconspicuous as a shadow in a room full of neon. She felt the heavy, cold weight of the brass key in her coat pocket, a key to a safe deposit box that now held the original, notarized partnership agreements Gavin thought had been incinerated 7 years ago. Her hands were steady, even as she watched him drape an arm around a city councilman, laughing with the booming, hollow confidence of a man who believed he had successfully buried his past. "You really shouldn't be here, Val." The voice was oily and familiar. She didn't have to turn to know Justin was standing behind her. She could smell his cologne, the same aggressive, spicy scent he'd worn back when they were a family, back before he'd traded his daughter's future for a vice presidency and a company car. "It's a public event, Justin," she said, her voice a low, calm contrast to the frantic energy of the gala. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Gavin, who was now gesturing toward a massive architectural rendering on a display board. It was her father's design, polished and rebranded with the G-Build logo. "It's a private celebration for people who actually contribute to this city," Justin snapped, stepping into her peripheral vision. He adjusted his silk tie, his eyes scanning her modest wool coat with a sneer of pure condescension. "Look at you. You look like you're here to clean the floors after we leave. Do yourself a favor and walk away before Gavin sees you and decides to have security escort you out. It'll be embarrassing for everyone, especially Lily." Valerie finally turned her head, her gaze so sharp and frigid that he actually flinched. "Don't you ever use her name again. You lost that right the second you signed that non-disclosure agreement for Gavin's hush money." Justin's face flushed a deep, mottled red. "I did what I had to do to provide. You were always too sentimental, Valerie. That's why you're standing in the dirt while we're building the skyline. Gavin is the visionary. You're just the ghost of a failed firm." He turned on his heel and marched toward the VIP tent, his posture stiff with unearned importance. Valerie watched him go, a small, cold smile touching her lips. He had no idea that the visionary he served was currently standing on a foundation of legal quicksand. A hand touched her elbow, light and reassuring. Marcus appeared beside her, looking every bit the high-powered attorney in a navy pinstripe suit. He leaned in, his voice a mere whisper against the backdrop of a string quartet playing somewhere near the bar. "The injunction was filed 20 minutes ago," Marcus said, his eyes fixed on the stage where Gavin was preparing to speak. "The process server is positioned by the press pool. The second Gavin touches that microphone, the ink is dry. He won't just be stopping construction. He'll be answering for 7 years of diverted funds." "And the deed transfer?" Valerie asked. "Verified and locked. The land title never legally left your father's estate because the signatures Gavin used were forged on a secondary document. Technically, Gavin is currently trespassing on property owned by VM Holdings." Valerie felt a surge of adrenaline, a sharp, electric spark that warmed her against the evening chill. She thought of the nights she'd spent in their cramped apartment, counting pennies for Lily's school supplies while Gavin toasted his success in penthouses. She thought of the way her father's name had been erased from the annals of the city's architecture, replaced by the hollow brand of a thief. "Let's get closer," she said. "I want to hear every word of his speech." They moved through the crowd, weaving past socialites in furs and investors clinking crystal flutes of champagne. The sound of a camera shutter's rapid-fire click echoed as Gavin stepped onto the small wooden dais. He tapped the microphone, the feedback whining through the speakers and silencing the chatter. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gavin began, his voice amplified and dripping with a faux humility that made Valerie's skin crawl. "They say that to build something great, you have to have a singular vision. When I started G-Build, I didn't just want to build apartments. I wanted to build a legacy. I wanted to create a landmark that would stand as a testament to what one man can achieve when he refuses to take no for an answer." A smattering of applause broke out. Gavin beamed, his eyes roaming the crowd with the predatory satisfaction of a king surveying his subjects. He didn't see Valerie yet. He was too busy basking in the reflected glow of the stage lights. "This project, Hall Heights, is more than just steel and glass," he continued, gripping the sides of the podium. "It is the culmination of years of hard work, of strategic risks, and quite frankly, of knowing when to leave the past behind. Some people are content to stay small. Some people are content to live in the shadows of what used to be. But here, today, we move forward." He reached down and picked up the silver shovel, holding it aloft like a scepter. The press surged forward, lenses focusing on the polished metal. "Before we break this ground," Gavin said, his voice dropping to a theatrical, conspiratorial tone, "I want to make one thing very clear. This is my city, and this is my masterpiece." He stepped off the dais toward the small patch of ceremonial dirt. The crowd held its breath, the silence thick with anticipation. Valerie stepped forward, breaking the line of the VIPs, her eyes locked on Gavin's face. Just as his foot hit the grass, a man in a plain tan jacket stepped out from behind a camera operator. He wasn't a photographer. He didn't have a flute of champagne. He held a thick, blue-backed legal envelope. Gavin froze, the shovel halfway to the ground. His eyes darted from the man to the envelope, and then, finally, he saw her. Across the 20 feet of manicured lawn and expensive expectations, his gaze met Valerie's. The arrogant smirk on his face didn't just fade, it curdled. "Gavin Hall?" the man in the tan jacket asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. Gavin didn't answer. He couldn't. He was staring at Valerie, who stood perfectly still, her chin tilted up, a silent witness to the beginning of the end. "You've been served," the man said, thrusting the papers toward Gavin's chest. The silver shovel slipped from Gavin's hand, hitting the dirt with a dull, pathetic thud that echoed louder than any speech he could have ever given. The landslide had begun. The cameras were still rolling, their red tally lights glowing like predatory eyes in the afternoon sun. Gavin Hall stood frozen, the thick legal envelope pressed against his expensive suit jacket like a brand. The smell of damp, freshly turned earth from the ceremonial hole mingled with the sharp, metallic scent of his sudden, cold sweat. "This is a mistake," Gavin hissed, his voice cracking as he looked at the man in the tan jacket. He tried to force a laugh, a dry, rattling sound that died in his throat. He turned toward the row of investors, his face twisting into a mask of performative outrage. "Valerie is clearly having some sort of breakdown. To serve papers at a groundbreaking, it's desperate. It's pathetic." Valerie didn't flinch. She stood 10 feet away, her silhouette sharp against the backdrop of the construction cranes she had secretly decommissioned an hour ago. She watched him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a dying nerve. "Open it, Gavin," she said. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried over the hum of the idling machinery. Justin stepped forward, his face pale as he looked between the two of them. "Valerie, let's just talk about this in private. You're making a scene." "Think about Lily." "I am thinking about her," she replied, her gaze shifting to Justin for a fraction of a second. The look was so cold he actually took a step back, his polished loafers slipping on the loose gravel. "I'm thinking about the father who stole her inheritance to fund a fraud." Gavin ripped the envelope open, his movements frantic and clumsy. He pulled out a stack of documents, his eyes scanning the bold headers. "A restraining order, a freeze on assets. You can't do this. G-Build is a private entity." Marcus stepped into the light, adjusting his glasses. The lead counsel for VM Holdings looked every bit the shark he was. "Actually, Gavin, if you turn to page 4, you'll see the deed of transfer. You see, the holding company you used to funnel the development loans, the one you thought was a blind offshore trust. It wasn't blind. It was mine. Or rather, it was Valerie's. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating thing that seemed to press the air out of the lungs of everyone present. The investors, including the formidable Mrs. Gable, the board chair who had once called Valerie a charming accessory, began to lean in. The camera operators zoomed in, the lens focusing tight on Gavin's trembling hands. The transformation in Gavin was visceral. The florid, sun-reddened hue of his arrogance drained away in a jagged wave, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. His jaw didn't just drop. It hung loose, the muscles in his neck corded and straining as he tried to swallow a truth that was too large for his throat. His eyes, usually sharp with predatory intent, became glassy and unfocused, darting toward the cameras he had invited, now capturing every second of his public disintegration. A fine tremor started in his lower lip, a twitch he couldn't suppress no matter how hard he clenched his teeth. He looked smaller, the shoulder pads of his designer suit suddenly appearing too wide for his collapsing frame. "You," Gavin choked out, the word barely a whisper. "You bought the debt." "I bought everything," Valerie said, stepping closer. The sound of her heels on the plywood stage was like the ticking of a clock. "I bought the land you're standing on, I bought the equipment behind you, and as of 9 o'clock this morning I bought the G-Build trademark." Mrs. Gable stepped forward, her silk scarf fluttering in the breeze. "Gavin, is this true? Are our investments tied to a company that no longer owns its own name?" Gavin turned to her, his hands out as if to catch a falling building. "Mrs. Gable, please, she's manipulating the numbers. It's a trick." "The only trick," Marcus interrupted, holding up a tablet that displayed a live feed of the G-Build headquarters, "is the one where you thought you could use your wife's intellectual property as collateral for a Ponzi scheme. The forensic audit is already in the hands of the district attorney." Justin looked like he wanted to vanish into the dirt. He avoided Valerie's eyes, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He was a man who had bet on the wrong horse, and the realization was etched in the sudden sag of his shoulders. Valerie walked to the edge of the stage, looking down at the silver shovel Gavin had dropped. It lay in the dirt, a useless piece of theater. She looked up at the reporters, her expression one of serene finality. "You spent years telling me I was a footnote in your story, Gavin," she said, her voice echoing through the silent construction site. "I didn't just write the ending. I bought the publisher. You have 1 hour to vacate my property before security assists you." She didn't wait for his reply. She didn't stay to watch the investors swarm him or the reporters thrust microphones into his ashen face. She turned and walked toward the waiting black car where Marcus was already opening the door. As the door closed, Valerie caught one last glimpse of Gavin in the rearview mirror. He was standing in the middle of his empty hole, surrounded by the ruins of a kingdom that had never truly been his. The landslide hadn't just begun, it was over. And she was the only one left standing. The fluorescent lights of the City Planning Commission hearing room hummed with a low, clinical buzz that grated against the nerves of everyone present. The air smelled of industrial floor wax and the bitter, oversteeped coffee sitting in cardboard cups on the commissioner's dais. Gavin Hall sat at the witness table, adjusting his silk tie with a flourish of practiced confidence. He looked every bit the titan of industry, unbothered by the fact that 24 hours ago, he had been physically barred from his own flagship project. The claims made by Valerie Marie Hall are not only fraudulent, they are a desperate attempt at character assassination by a woman who has never understood the complexities of high-level development, Gavin said, his voice smooth and projecting perfectly for the microphones. He leaned back, a smug half-smile playing on his lips as he glanced toward the gallery where the press sat with pens poised. "She was a silent partner in name only, a courtesy I extended during our marriage. She has no legal claim to the G-Build assets, and these supposed deeds she produced are clearly sophisticated forgeries." Valerie sat behind Marcus at the petitioner's table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't flinch at the insult. She didn't look at the cameras. She simply watched the digital clock on the wall. Beside Gavin, Justin sat with his head held high, though his fingers tapped a nervous, erratic rhythm against his thigh. "Mr. Hall," the lead commissioner said, peering over her glasses. You are testifying, under oath, that you have never diverted G-Build capital into private offshore accounts to bypass the primary stakeholders' oversight. Gavin didn't hesitate. I swear it. Every cent of investment has been poured into the soil of this city. My ex-wife's accusations are the delusions of someone who couldn't handle being left behind. A ripple of low whispers broke out in the room. It was the first rage spike of the morning, the sheer audacity of his lie, delivered with a wink toward the front row. Justin leaned in, whispering something to Gavin that made them both chuckle, a private joke shared at the expense of the woman who had built the very foundation they stood upon. Marcus stood up slowly. He didn't look like a man about to fight. He looked like a man about to perform an autopsy. Mr. Hall, you just stated that you never diverted funds. Would you like to revise that statement before I introduce Exhibit F? Gavin let out a sharp, barking laugh. Introduce whatever scrap of paper you've cooked up, Marcus. My books are clean. They aren't your books, Valerie said quietly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through Gavin's laughter like a razor through silk. It was the first time she had spoken, and the room went deathly silent. Marcus tapped a key on his laptop. The twin 60-inch monitors on the walls flickered to life. Instead of a simple spreadsheet, a video file began to play. It was a high-definition recording from a hidden security feed in Gavin's private study, dated only 3 nights ago. On the screen, Gavin and Justin were clearly visible, clinking glasses of amber liquid. To the sleeping lion, Gavin's voice boomed from the speakers, dripping with mockery. May she stay asleep while we drain the Cayman account for the penthouse in Dubai. She'll be too busy counting her pennies to realize the treasury is empty. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that had weight, pressing down on the lungs of everyone in the room. Gavin's hand, which had been resting casually on the table, began to tremor. The color didn't just leave his face. It seemed to be sucked out by an invisible vacuum, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent shade of gray that made the expensive tan he'd gotten in Cabo look like a mask of cheap clay. His jaw didn't just drop. It hung slack and crooked, the muscles in his cheeks twitching with a frantic, involuntary rhythm as he stared at his own image on the screen. His eyes, once sharp and predatory, became glassy and unfocused, darting toward the heavy oak doors of the hearing room as his breathing hitched into a ragged, audible wheeze that echoed through the silent chamber. He looked smaller, the tailored shoulders of his suit suddenly appearing 3 sizes too large for a man who was shrinking in real time. The lead commissioner found her voice first. Mr. Hall, you are currently in a government hearing. You have just committed perjury in front of this commission and a room full of officers. Justin's chair screeched against the floor as he pushed himself away from Gavin, as if the man were suddenly radioactive. I had nothing to do with the offshore accounts, Justin stammered, his face pale as he looked toward the press. I was following orders. You were choosing a side, Justin, Valerie said, standing up. She smoothed the front of her modest gray blazer, the fabric cool and crisp under her palms. She felt a strange sense of calm, a stillness that had been years in the making. And you chose the side that's currently sinking. The gallery erupted. Reporters were shouting questions, flashes from cameras strobed against the walls, and 2 uniformed bailiffs began to move toward the witness table. The investors who had been sitting behind Gavin, men who had laughed at his jokes only minutes before, were already standing, their backs turned to him as they spoke urgently into their phones. They were cutting him loose, the scent of blood in the water far stronger than any loyalty he thought he had bought. Valerie picked up her leather-bound folder. She didn't wait for the commissioner to gavel the chaos to order. She didn't stay to watch the bailiffs place their hands on Gavin's shoulders as he began to loudly, desperately blame his accountants. She walked toward the exit, Marcus a half-step behind her. As she reached the heavy doors, she paused and looked back at the man who had tried to erase her from her own life. He was hunched over the table, a broken shell of a man surrounded by the wreckage of his own arrogance. You told me once that I was a footnote, Gavin, she said, her voice carrying over the din of the room. But you forgot one thing about footnotes. They're the only part of the book that's actually verified. She pushed open the doors and stepped out into the hallway, the cool air of the corridor a welcome relief. She didn't look back. The landslide was complete, and for the first time in a decade, she could hear the sound of her own footsteps without the weight of his shadow following behind. Marcus checked his watch. The freeze on his personal assets was just approved. He won't even be able to pay for the ride to the precinct. Valerie nodded, her thoughts already turning to Lily. Good. I have a daughter to pick up from school. 6 months had passed since the heavy glass doors of the boardroom had swung shut behind her for the last time. Valerie Marie Hall stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new corner office, watching the autumn sun dip below the skyline. The air in the room smelled of cedar and expensive stationery, a sharp contrast to the stale, fear-scented atmosphere of her previous life. She smoothed the fabric of her tailored charcoal suit, feeling the weight of the VM Holdings pin on her lapel. It wasn't just a logo, it was a reclamation. A soft knock at the door broke her concentration. Marcus stepped inside, his usual sharp suit replaced by a slightly more relaxed blazer. He carried a single manila folder, but the look on his face told her everything she needed to know before he even spoke. The final liquidation is complete, he said, moving to the mahogany desk. He didn't sit. There was a new level of respect in his posture, a recognition of the woman who had dismantled an empire to build a better one. Gavin Hall officially signed over the remaining personal equity this morning. The G-Build name is being retired effective immediately. Valerie turned from the window. Where is he, Marcus? A studio apartment in the East District, he replied, his voice devoid of pity. It's situated right above a 24-hour laundromat. The noise is constant, and the heat from the dryers makes the floor warp. He tried to argue for a larger allowance from the remaining trust, but the judge reminded him that restitution for the defrauded subcontractors comes first. He's currently looking for work in consulting, but word has traveled. No one will take his calls. She felt a strange, hollow flick of satisfaction. Gavin, the man who had once mocked her for wearing off-brand shoes and suggested she wasn't sophisticated enough for his social circle, was now living in the very conditions he had spent a lifetime sneering at. The performative wealth, the Rolexes, the Italian leather, all of it had been stripped away, leaving only the small, bitter man underneath. "And Justin?" she asked, her voice softening. Marcus opened the folder. "He's back in sales. A mid-level firm in the suburbs. He reached out to my office 3 times last week, asking if you'd be willing to discuss visitation adjustments now that things have settled. I told him all communication regarding Lily must go through the court-appointed coordinator." Valerie nodded. Justin had chosen the shadow of a bully over the light of his own daughter. He had traded his integrity for a vice presidency that lasted less than a year. Now he was just another face in a cubicle, haunted by the knowledge that he had bet on the wrong horse. "Lily is waiting downstairs," Marcus reminded her gently. "The driver is ready. Thank you, Marcus, for everything." She gathered her coat and walked through the open-plan office. Her employees moved with a quiet efficiency that lacked the frantic desperation Gavin had demanded. She had built this culture on the ruins of his arrogance, and it was thriving. Downstairs, the cool evening air hit her face, carrying the scent of damp pavement and wood smoke. A modest black sedan waited at the curb. As the door opened, a small, vibrant force of nature launched itself at her. "Mom, look," Lily cried, thrusting a finger-painted masterpiece toward her. It was a chaotic swirl of gold and violet. "I made a crown for the office." Valerie caught her daughter, the warmth of the girl's laughter grounding her in a way no bank balance ever could. She tucked a stray hair behind Lily's ear, noticing how much the girl looked like her, the same steady eyes, the same stubborn set of the jaw. "It's beautiful, Lily. We'll put it right on the main wall," Valerie whispered. As the car pulled away from the curb, Valerie glanced back at the towering glass structure they were leaving behind. She had won. She had the company, the assets, and the public vindication. The industry had watched Gavin's spectacular fall and her meteoric rise with a mix of awe and terror. But as she looked down at Lily, who was busy explaining the specific merits of purple glitter, Valerie felt the sharp, lingering ache of the cost. She thought of the decade she had spent being diminished, The years she had allowed herself to believe she was a footnote in someone else's story. She thought of the father Lily would never truly know, not the real man, only the ghost of the hero she'd imagined. The victory was absolute, but the innocence was gone. She was the sleeping lion who had finally woken up, but she knew she would never be able to sleep quite as soundly again. The car turned the corner, and the shadow of the skyscraper fell away. Valerie reached out and took her daughter's hand, her grip firm and protective. The view from the top was breathtaking, but the most important thing she had discovered was that she no longer needed a mountain to stand on to feel tall. She looked ahead into the gathering dark, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. The landslide was over. The dust had settled. And for the first time in her life, Valerie Marie Hall knew exactly who she was.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.